Think like a safety net. Quiet, invisible, always there. Until the day everything falls apart and suddenly everyone needs to know where I went. I spent 17 years at Meridian Logistics Solutions. 17 years building something from the ground up, maintaining it, protecting it, updating it at 2 in the morning, when nobody else was awake and the servers were throwing errors that would have shut down operations by 6 a.m. if I hadn't caught them. 17 years of that, and when they finally let me go, the guy who signed my termination letter couldn't even spell my last name right. It's Okafor, 2 syllables. Not complicated. I'm not bitter about it anymore. I want to be clear about that. What I am is honest. And honestly, the way things ended, the way I ended things, is a story I think a lot of people need to hear. Because I know I'm not the only one who's ever been invisible inside a place they helped build. My name is Adrian Okafor. I was 52 years old when Meridian showed me the door. I'd started there at 35, fresh off a contract gig with a supply chain company in Cincinnati that had gone under. My brother-in-law at the time, a guy named Phil who's no longer married to my sister, and we don't really talk about why, he'd mentioned that a small logistics startup downtown was looking for someone to set up their network infrastructure. They had 12 employees, 1 functional server that was being held together with what I can only describe as optimism, and a founder named Gideon Crane who wore the same khaki vest every single day and talked about disrupting regional freight like it was a religion. I went in for what was supposed to be a 2-week consulting engagement. I stayed for 17 years. In the beginning, it was genuinely exciting. There were maybe 15 of us total, and everyone did everything. I wired the conference room myself. I set up the VoIP system. I built the inventory tracking software from scratch because we couldn't afford the licensing fees for anything commercial. And Gideon said, "Adrian, you're the only person here who actually knows what you're doing, so just figure it out." So I did. I figured it out. The software I built, I called it internally Milo, short for Meridian Integrated Logistics Operations, became the backbone of everything the company did. Routing, tracking, client invoicing, carrier management, warehouse scheduling. I built it piece by piece over about 3 years, and by the time the company had grown to 60 employees, Milo was handling 38% of all operational decisions automatically. No one had to approve it. No one had to authorize it. It just ran because I kept it running. Here's the thing about being an IT systems guy in a company that's growing fast. They need you desperately right up until the moment they decide they don't. And somewhere around year 10, I noticed the shift. New executives came in. A CFO named Darren who had an MBA from a school I'd never heard of and referred to everything as a cost center. A CFO who'd come from a major competitor and kept saying things like, "We need to modernize our infrastructure," which I found ironic because I was sitting right there. A VP of technology who'd been brought in from outside and had exactly zero knowledge of what our systems actually did, but had very strong opinions about what they should look like. I was not invited to those conversations. Nobody asked me, "Hey Adrian, how does Milo actually work?" Nobody sat down with me and said, "We're thinking about replacing this. What do you think?" What they did instead was bring in a third-party consulting firm called Apex Systems Group, pay them $400,000 over 6 months to audit our infrastructure, and receive a report that recommended, among other things, migrating away from our proprietary legacy platform. That's what they called Milo, a legacy platform, to a commercial solution called FreightFlow Pro. I read that report, all of it, twice. I didn't say anything. Because here's what the Apex consultants didn't know. What the VP of technology didn't know. What Darren, the CFO, definitely didn't know. Milo wasn't just software I'd written for the company. In the early days, when there was no budget, no legal department, no formal employment contracts, just Gideon handing out handshake deals and promises about equity that never materialized, I had registered the copyright for Milo under my own name, my personal name. Adrian Emmanuel Okafor. Gideon had known. Back in year 2, when I'd done it, he'd actually encouraged it. "Better you hold it than nobody," he'd said. "This way we know it's protected." We had a verbal agreement, the kind you make when you're a startup with no lawyers and everyone trusts everyone, that as long as I was with the company, they had full use of the software. No licensing fee. No formal contract. Just trust. Trust. What a word! By the time year 17 arrived, Gideon had long since cashed out his stake and moved to Scottsdale. The company had gone through 2 rounds of private equity funding. The people running it had never met Gideon, didn't know the history, and had absolutely no idea that the software keeping their entire operation alive was, legally and unambiguously, mine. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't sitting at my desk every day plotting revenge. I was just doing my job, keeping things running, fixing the things that broke, going to meetings where nobody introduced me or explained what I did, watching younger people get promoted into roles that touched work I'd created, and not saying anything, because that's what you do when you've been told, implicitly, for years, that you're support staff and not leadership. But I did renew the copyright every year. That part was automatic. I just kept doing it. The call came on a Tuesday in October. I was asked to come in for a meeting with HR and the VP of Technology. I'd been in enough of those rooms to know what the furniture arrangement means. 2 people on one side, 1 chair on the other, a box of tissues on the table that nobody ever uses but is always there like a prop. They told me that Meridian was restructuring its technology division and that my position was being eliminated as part of a strategic realignment. They said they were moving to FreightFlow Pro and that the transition would be handled by the Apex team. They thanked me for 17 years of service. The HR manager, a woman who joined the company about 8 months prior and had never once spoken to me in the hallway, said, "We really appreciate everything you've contributed." She mispronounced my last name. OK4. She said, OK4. I didn't correct her. I just nodded. I signed the paperwork. I accepted the severance 6 weeks, which for 17 years of service is the kind of math that tells you exactly what you were worth to them. I handed over my access credentials, my badge, my company laptop. I shook hands with both of them. I walked out. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a while. I called my daughter, who was a junior in college at the time and always seemed to know the right thing to say. She didn't say much. She just said, "Dad, you okay?" I said I was fine. And then I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about Milo, not in an angry way, just practically, because here's what I knew that they didn't. The migration to FreightFlow Pro wasn't just a software switch. Milo wasn't some simple database they could export a spreadsheet from. It was deeply integrated. It had 17 years of custom logic baked into it, routing algorithms calibrated to their specific carrier relationships, exception handling rules built around their clients' particular quirks, a predictive maintenance scheduler that I'd spent 4 months developing that their 3 biggest accounts had specifically contracted for. None of that was transferable. None of it could be rebuilt in weeks. And all of it was mine. I called a lawyer the next morning, not because I'd planned this, because I needed to understand where I actually stood. The lawyer, a woman I'd found through a referral, sharp, no nonsense, exactly the kind of person you want in your corner, spent 2 hours going through everything. The copyright registrations, the lack of any employment agreement specifying work for hire, the absence of any IP assignment clause in any document I'd ever signed. She looked up from her notes and said, "Adrian, they don't own any of this." I said I knew. She said, "Do they know?" I said, "Probably not." She said, "Okay, so here's what we can do." We didn't do anything aggressive. I want to be clear about that. What we did was send a letter, a formal, polite, legally precise letter to Meridian's general counsel, informing them that the software known internally as Milo was the registered intellectual property of Adrian Emmanuel Okafor, that its continued use by Meridian Logistics Solutions without a licensing agreement constituted copyright infringement, and that effective 30 days from the date of the letter, continued use would require either a formal licensing arrangement or cessation of use. 30 days. I sent it on a Thursday. The following Monday, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Darren, the CFO, and I will tell you that I have listened to that voicemail more times than I'm comfortable admitting. He sounded, and there is no other word for this, panicked. He said there must be some misunderstanding. He said he'd like to schedule a call. He said, "I'm sure we can work this out quickly." I didn't call back that day. The thing about Milo was that by the time they got the letter, the Apex team was already 3 weeks into the FreightFlow Pro migration, and they were already behind schedule. Because what they discovered fairly quickly was that you can't just unplug 17 years of custom infrastructure and plug in something commercial without consequences. The data migration alone was a disaster. Fields that didn't map correctly, historical records that the new system couldn't pass, carrier integrations that had to be rebuilt from scratch. 2 of their major client accounts had already escalated complaints about shipment tracking errors. One of them, a regional grocery chain out of Columbus that I'd personally onboarded back in year 6, had sent a formal notice of concern. So when my letter arrived, they weren't in a position of strength. They were in a position of absolute operational fragility. My lawyer and I had one meeting with their legal team. I said almost nothing during that meeting. I let her do the talking, which is what you should do when you've hired someone excellent. Their team spent about 45 minutes arguing that Milo had been developed during my employment and therefore belonged to the company. My lawyer spent about 12 minutes explaining why they were wrong. She had the copyright registrations. She had documentation of the timeline. She had the fact that I'd used personal equipment during the first 2 years of development. She had, and this was the one that seemed to land the hardest, a company email from year 2 in which Gideon himself had written to me, "Since this is your work product and you're registering it yourself, we should formalize our arrangement at some point." We had never formalized anything. The lawyer asked for a recess. When they came back, the conversation had changed. What we settled on, and I'm not going to share the specific numbers because my lawyer advised against it, and also because frankly it's nobody's business, was a licensing agreement that compensated me for the period of unregistered use, a structured arrangement for the remaining migration period during which they still needed Milo operational, and a separate consulting fee if they wanted my help during the transition. They wanted my help during the transition. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for exactly 4 days. Then I said yes because I'm not a cruel person and I didn't want a grocery chain in Columbus to have their refrigeration scheduling go sideways because of something that was ultimately between me and a CFO who couldn't be bothered to learn who built the thing keeping his company alive. I spent 8 weeks as a paid consultant helping them migrate. I was paid more per hour than I had made in a year at certain points in my career there. The VP of technology, the one who'd never asked me how anything worked, had the decency to shake my hand on my last day and say, "I had no idea what you'd built here." I said thank you. I meant it genuinely. Do I wish things had gone differently? Yes, I wish I'd been seen for what I was while I was there. I wish someone had said at some point, in 17 years, "Adrian, this thing you built is remarkable, and we want to make sure you know how much it matters." I wish the severance had been more than 6 weeks. I wish someone had learned to say my name. But I also know this, being invisible for that long teaches you something. It teaches you exactly where the weight is being carried. And when you know where the weight is, you know what happens when you step aside. I'm not rebuilding Milo for anyone else. I went home after those 8 weeks and I started something new. A small consulting practice, just me and 2 people I trust, helping mid-sized logistics companies build infrastructure that actually belongs to them. Clean documentation, proper IP assignment, no verbal agreements, no handshake deals that dissolve when the company gets acquired and the guy who made the promise moves to Scottsdale. I named the practice Foundational Systems Group, not as a reference to anything at Meridian, just because it felt true. My daughter asked me, a few months after everything settled, whether I felt like I'd gotten justice. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "I feel like I finally stopped being furniture." She laughed. She said, "Dad, you were never furniture." I know that now, but for 17 years I let them think I was, and that's the last mistake I'll ever make about my own worth. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not obsess over it, just sit with it. And the thing I keep coming back to isn't the settlement or the voicemail from Darren or even the moment my lawyer said they don't own any of this. The thing I keep coming back to is how long I let myself be worth less than I was. That's the part that stays. There's a version of the story where I'm the hero from the beginning, where I walked in on day 1 knowing exactly what I was building and exactly what it would cost them someday to lose me. But that's not true, and I don't think he would have taught me anything worth passing on. The truth is, I spent 17 years being quietly, voluntarily small, not because I was forced to, because I'd convinced myself that keeping my head down and doing excellent work was enough, that the work would speak, that good systems don't need advocates because they just run and everyone can see them running. What I didn't understand until it was almost too late is that invisible work doesn't speak, it hums, and people stop hearing hums. What happened to me with Meridian wasn't random. It wasn't bad luck. Gideon built something good in the early days, but he built it on handshakes and good faith, and when he left, none of that transferred. The people who came after him, Darren, the VP, the Apex consultants, weren't malicious. They were just operating in an environment where nothing was written down, nothing was formalized, and the person who held the most institutional knowledge had never once raised his hand and said, "Actually, let me explain what I built here and why it matters." That person was me, and that silence was a choice I made every single day for years. The copyright on Milo didn't save me because I was clever. It saved me because I'd done one thing right at the very beginning without fully understanding why. I'd put my name on my work. Not to be difficult, not as a strategy, just because Gideon had said it was the right thing to do, and I had agreed, and I'd kept renewing it year after year out of habit. Habit protected me when judgment hadn't been necessary yet. That's the part I think about most when I talk to younger people in my field now. Not the legal maneuver, not the settlement, the habit. The quiet, consistent practice of knowing what belongs to you and keeping that knowledge current, even when it seems unnecessary. Especially when it seems unnecessary. Because the moment it becomes necessary, you won't have time to start. I'm not the same person who walked out of that parking lot in October. I'm more careful now, not suspicious, just careful, about what I put in writing, about what I agree to verbally, and what I insist on formalizing, about how clearly I communicate the value of what I do before someone else decides to define it for me. My daughter asked me once if I regretted not doing all of this sooner. I told her I regretted the years I spent making myself easy to overlook. But I don't regret the lesson. You can't buy that kind of clarity. You have to live through the thing that teaches it to you. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from all of this, it's not protect your IP or get everything in writing, though both of those are true. It's simpler than that. Know what you're worth before the room decides for you, because rooms will always decide, and they will always decide in their own favor if you haven't already made the case for yourself. I stopped being furniture the day I walked out of Meridian. I just wish I'd stopped sooner.